What is up, everybody? Welcome to Bettor Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Aguiar, and I'm excited to be joined this week by one of my favorite people in the space, Joel Schreck. You can find Joel alongside David Bileski and myself every Tuesday night on our PGA Draftcast show here at Win Daily Sports. We co-host and draft DFS lineups against the industry's best audience. Once again, be sure to join us at 6 o'clock Pacific time, 9 o'clock Eastern every week to take part in that draft. We promise you will have fun. You will be part of the most interactive show in the space. And hopefully in the process, you learn a little bit something about how we make our builds. So please check that out if you're not doing so already. You can also find Joel on Twitter at DraftMasterFlex. But Joel, we talked last night with each other. We're back here doing Bettor Golf. First of all, I appreciate you joining me. Nick is not able to make it. He's on vacation this week. But how's everything going with you?
It's good. I'm excited to join you today. The Bettor Golf Show is an awesome show, especially if you're betting on any golf tournament. So to be invited to join you for the John Deere was flattering, and I'm excited to break it down with you.
Before we get started, I do very quickly just want to give a shout out to the podcast sponsor of this show. That's going to be Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is now offering their new Pick 8 special where you can add 8 selections to your Pick'em entry and win up to 325 times your money. Code BGP gets you an additional first-time deposit offer to add even more to your bankroll before you get started, including what is, I like this a lot, Joel. I don't know how much you've checked out Underdog, but they offer these special bets on there. That's their way of randomly boosting your bankroll. They'll offer things like in the golf spectrum. Will a certain player get over 0.5 pars during the round? That's a way for they're trying to boost your bankroll. There's a lot of different ways to get action down at Underdog Fantasy. So if you're not doing so already, use the code BGP to get started. Joel, when we look at this tournament, we spent, I would say 15 minutes talking about the course and everything over on our Draftcast show. I don't want to talk too much about the venue. I think you've already heard it. If you've gotten to Wednesday at this point of the week, you kind of know where you're at with the venue and what's going on with that. But very quickly, one of the things that Nick and I like to do before we get started on the show, is there any bet out there as far as a wager goes that you like this week that you would like to drop on the show before we start looking at the DFS board?
Well, I'll start by saying I think because of this watered down field, I think the value this week is really in the top 30 or top 40 markets, because after the top, let's call it 15 to be conservative, to me, a lot of these guys are pretty equal. And so you're getting plus value on some guys that I just think are better golfers in this field than they should be. So more so than even matchups, I think you can really target me specifically. I highlighted the top 30 as where I'm targeting guys where there's some really good value. And to name a few, Seamus Power, who you drafted, I believe, on the show last night. He was definitely drafted on the Draftcast. Has played really well at this tournament in the past. His form is pretty good. And kind of those tournaments we wait to see Seamus Power are the ones that are these watered down fields where he doesn't have to see the likes of Scotty Scheffler and Rory McIlroy. This feels like one where he'll get you a really nice result. And you're getting him right now at plus odds in the top 30 market. So he's one I'll list, but the guys in my top 30 card are currently as it stands are Power, Svensson, Joel Dahman, Novak, Vegas, and Daniel Berger.
I like that comment that you talked about there, because I think when you look at tournaments like this, and I've heard this narrative spewed across the industry quite frequently this week, where you get I guess there's no other way to call it. It's a watered down field at its very core here. I do think you have golfers that if we look in 2 or 3 years, they might end up being top 20 players in the world. But one of the narratives that I've heard just over and over again is because we have a weaker tournament, there is more volatility that comes into play. Maybe at the very top end that could happen, but I tend to agree with you, Joel. I think that there are certain gaps in the skill sets that we're seeing to where your high-end players inside of my model have a gap from the next tier. That next tier has a gap from the next tier. We're actually seeing these really big deviations in my sheet from what the expectation would be. So I agree with what you have to say about that. I don't know if you're frozen on me right now, Joel. It looks like you are on my end, but very quickly before you get back with it, I'll touch on some of the bets that I like. So I took Dylan Wu minus 123 over SH Kim. That was a profile that I was trying to take on in SH Kim. My matchups are always going to come down to, can I find a person that I want to fade? And if I can find the person I want to fade, do I have enough value in the opponent or the person that I'm actually going to be backing in those spots? So Dylan Wu for me was one of those options that just carried a ton of value that I think the market is a little bit too low on recently. If you look at the outright market, that to me is where a lot of my value came into play. It's been very close the last couple of weeks. I see you're back now, Joel. That's a good sign with this. But in the outright market, I've come in second place 4 of the past 5 tournaments. Very close to hitting an outright winner. Just haven't been able to get it over the top with it. But got Aaron Rai at 22-1. I thought he was the best value on the board when things open. I took JT Poston. You can find that at 35-1. Rio hits Satsune. I feel like that's our boy combined, Joel. One of us is on him every single week, it feels like, for the most part there. Got him at 66-1. You can find a 75-1 out there in the market. That's the best value on the board. Took Doug Gim at 80-1. And then Daniel Berger, 80-1. So kind of a double down there with the Berger take. But to go back to what you said, Joel, I think this is one of those tournaments where you can get an edge in some of these placement markets. So like the way you built your card there. Let's push this into the actual DFS board. So let's start in the $10,000 range. Unfortunately, and this is one of like the unfortunate situations we keep finding ourselves in here, Cantlay was listed on the odds board and then withdraws after the odds had come out. So it gives you this position now where there's 4 players, $10,000 and up. Aaron Rai, 10,000, Sungjae Im, 10,300, Sepp Straka, 10,400, Jordan Spieth, 10,500. When you look at that range, what do you see here? Are there any players that you are looking to completely fade? Are there any of those options that you're looking to back a little bit heavier? And if so, what are those contests that you're looking to do? I know that you specifically play in a lot of big money, smaller field groups. So it's not going to be your prototypical GPPs of what you're looking for. Maybe in some of these spots, you don't have to get as aggressive there, but I'll let you take that question.
Well, before I dive in directly, I think one thing I was wanting to ask you about that we really didn't touch on the DraftCast at all is, are you interested or will you have any exposure to Jordan Spieth in this field?
So here's the thing about Jordan Spieth. And when I wrote my article at Rotoballer on Monday, I was expecting Jordan Spieth, and maybe this is where it comes down to, where do you trust the ownership percentage? Because I've seen some books or some places that are projecting sub 5%. I've seen other that have them in the 14, 15% range. It's the most vastly different expectation that we're getting here. I kind of gave the answer on Monday that if we can get a really low owned Jordan Spieth, some of the current ball striking metrics had been a lot better than what we had gotten from the results with it. Right now, inside of my model, I see about 13%. 13% is really heavy for me on a golfer that isn't necessarily carrying the best form with it. So I don't know if you're necessarily getting the leverage that I thought you were going to get in this position. Like at 13%, if I'm directly comparing, he's very equivalent to me. I'm trying to find an option here that would be about the same. Like, I don't see a huge difference between him and Seamus, I guess. Like, if we want to directly compare there, ownership is very on point with the two names. The projected win equity, Spieth is a little bit higher than him, but you're looking at a $2,200 difference there. So I don't know. That would be my answer. Do you have a differing take, Joel?
I do. And here's my take on Spieth. At 13%, he's probably not going to be relevant for me. I think that's a little bit too high. If it does come in under, let's call it 7% as a number. If it's under 7%, I think he's really interesting. And here's why. We talked last night a lot, and I'll reiterate it tonight. You don't need to use all your salary. Even with Jordan Spieth, you don't need to use all your salary. You can build a lineup this week, leaving a ton of money on the table. And so I would be way more hyper-focused on ownership than anything else. And so you look up here, Rai is going to be heavily owned. Sungjae is going to be heavily owned. Spieth, if he's under 7% owned, certainly has the upside. Now, he's not playing well. That's obvious. But he's also not playing in fields that are this weak. He's also usually not playing on courses that are this easy. And to think if someone can come up and have a surprise, really strong finish, of all the people in this field, that person's name being Jordan Spieth would be the one I would bet on versus a random person down there in the 7K range. So for those reasons, I think he makes a ton of sense for especially these big field GPPs, as long as it is coming in at under 7%.
I could see, and maybe this is where contest selection ends up playing a difference here. In some of these smaller field contests, maybe more of the nature of what you would be playing, I could see Spieth being, well, I don't know. Let me ask you this. I mean, you maybe can give me a better answer here. Do you think he would be higher owned or lower owned than in your large field GPPs?
I think he'll be higher owned in the large field than he would in a small competition.
You're probably, if you look at the market, like all the sharp money for the most part, which is a very interesting discussion to be had here. He's not a favorite over Sung Jae. He's not a favorite over Aaron Rai. He's a favorite over every other person, though, in the space that I've seen him against. So there's been some credible money that's come in on him. And one of the things I always talk about, and I guess my concern would be, I just think the ownership ends up being higher and we do get him in that 13, 14, 15% sort of range. But what I always say is people are way too fickle with what their takes are in this space. Like, I understand Jordan Spieth is too expensive on the surface, but if he's too expensive on the surface and he's carrying no ownership, there's leverage to be created there. He's a top 25 player in any model that you should be building. And depending on exactly how you build it, you can work him up really high. Like, Vegas likes him enough that it listed him as the favorite. Cantlay withdrew from the field, and all of a sudden he got bumped down a couple spots, which is just a really funky move there for him to fall. But you're still looking at, like, Vegas looking at a top 5 golfer there. Before his last tournament, he had gained off the tee in 10 consecutive starts. So I don't know. Yeah, I see. That's the problem. Like, let me bring up Zach's comment here very quickly. So there's been, I don't think he's going to be 25%. I also don't think, though, he's going to be 4%. To me, this is where my model, it took the high end, the low end of a lot of these options, and it landed him in this range, which he has fallen a little bit in fairness. Last night when I ran this, he was 14.5%. Now he's 12.5%. It probably would have to be sub 10% for me, though.
I would agree. I think the biggest thing to highlight on this decision, though, is more about the tournament, right? I think, and what we said before, kind of doubling down on that is, I'm leaned into, you don't need to spend all your money. There's a world where 5 of these top guys don't do well. And then all of a sudden the optimal lineup just doesn't even spend all their money. And so if that's the case, you can have a Jordan Spieth with upside and it coming in at really low ownership. Like, that's what you're looking for. So it shouldn't matter. Like, if Jordan Spieth was priced at 8K flat, that really shouldn't make a difference, a big one at least this week, unless you're like super overweight on like Rai and Sungjae, and that's the only way you can play is by getting them in your lineup, fine. But like, if you're not super overweight on 2 of these guys in the 10K range, it shouldn't matter what he's priced at because you don't need to spend all your dollars either way. So it's just looking at the ownership percentage.
Anybody else in that range that you're looking to fade completely?
No, I mean, I like Rai and Sungjae a lot. I also like Straka a lot. I think he's 3rd for me in that tier up after Rai and Sungjae. But I will be playing them. For me, it's going to be probably lining up one of them in most of my lineups and then kind of balancing out from there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it also goes back to what you were talking about of maybe not necessarily having to spend all your money. There would have been a different price scale, and I don't know what they would have put out, but it would have been slightly different if Cantlay would have removed before they put the pricing out. I think you would have seen a couple of these names go up. You probably would have a name or two that would be in this $10,000 range, whether it's a Maverick McNeely or whoever it is. So to answer Zach's question of the Sungjae trap, that would probably be for me the one that I am most fearful of that he ends up imploding. I know a lot of the recent metrics look really good, and we talked about it on DraftCast last night, more so David and myself. I know that you liked him, Joel, and it's not to say that I don't, but I had some concerns with his weighted proximity for this venue outside of the top 50 in a lot of the key metrics with the proximity totals I was looking for. I also think, though, when you look at the profile here, he's one of the safer targets on the board. So, like, it's the mix and the match of it to where the safety rating looks good. The upside mark doesn't necessarily look as good in my model. And I think you have to figure out what does that mean to you. And then the other interesting point, I don't know if you saw this, Joel. Sungjae is one of the most bet golfers this week in the outright market. So whether you want to say that's a good or a bad thing, usually it's not a good thing in that would be one of the answers. But here's what I found intriguing. At one of the sports books, he had a 7% of the wagers coming in on him, but his hold percentage was 14% of the bets. So when you have that sort of an outlook with it, that's usually the sharper wagers, like when the actual hold percentage is higher than the bets that are coming in. And double is a really significant total. You don't normally see it jump that much. So for me, that's kind of telling me that there are big money wagers coming in on Sungjae. I know when I talked to Nick yesterday, he seemed to think that it was Sungjae's tournament to lose, which he's probably not the only person, with you also drafting him, Joel, on the show. I think he was your first pick, correct?
First overall pick.
Yeah, the first overall pick in the draft. Exactly. So look, it makes a lot of sense. Like the thing is, you're just going to have to pick and choose your spots here. I do think that you could probably feasibly find a way to play everybody because it is so easy to make a build here, but you're just going to have to find a way to trim some of the fat on some of these ends here. So whether that's being super aggressive in the $10,000 section or as we dip down here into the 9,000s, we're going to have a lot of similar questions that are being asked of us. There's some ownership near at the very top of this board. McNeely, Thompson, McCarthy. I think they're going to be the most owned guys. You drop a little bit lower, JT Poston's going to hold his weight himself at what I see about to be 18%. But every other name there is between 8 to 11% with Jason Day, Keith Mitchell, Sam Stevens. So I'm going to set you up for this question, Joel, because I want to have a conversation about Keith Mitchell. And there's something I want to tell you that I didn't mention on the show. So anybody who tuned into the DraftCast last night will get this answer, which will kind of tie everything together. But of any of those low-owned guys, who are you intrigued by? And I'll let you talk about Keith Mitchell based off of that.
So are we talking just the low-owned guys in this 9K range?
Yes.
Well, the weird thing about that is if you look in the 9K range, I'm only seeing two guys that are really coming in low-owned. For the most part, everyone in this range, at least from what I'm saying, is over at least 12%.
So do you have Keith Mitchell higher based off of that answer?
He's showing at 13% for me right now.
Okay. I have him. So I have Jason Day at 8.46. I have Keith Mitchell at 11.29. I have Sam Stevens at 7.18. And then I have every other person in this section between 17 to 22%.
Okay. So I have to assume, are you specifically asking me about Jason Day without specifically saying Jason Day?
No, I actually want you to talk to me a little bit about Keith Mitchell because I think he's the interesting one here, even at the 13% total. I guess I'll talk about this a little bit before you give your answer here. So if you remember, Joel, and you asked me this as I think it was a borderline joke, and I actually gave an answer that went completely opposite of the answer that you probably expected me to give when you asked me, is the player in your model that's expected to make the most birdies the one that's going to be the one that's going to win the golf tournament? And here's the reason why it's not. Aaron Rai was my projected winner in my sheet, but the person who was expected to make the most birdies was Keith Mitchell. There are some concerns with the profile that he has, and there's a reason why he got bumped down ever so slightly. You look at some of the current form, the ball striking looks great. The putter continues to go south in a lot of these spots, but there was a positive trajectory expected increase in my model on bent grass greens. I am a believer, and whether it's 11% or 13%, I'm going to view that as the same percentage here for the most part. I don't think we get some massive difference between those two numbers. Mitchell is the name that has gotten such a sour taste in everybody's mouths because he continues to grade well in models. And he's coming out there for these events, and when he's the really popular choice, like there's really no other way to say it, he has fallen flat on his face over and over again. And I've gotten caught a million times. I know Nick has gotten caught a million times with it. But there are these situations that we always talk about where public perception goes too far. And Keith Mitchell, with any semblance of form, to me, is a realistic top 4 or 5 sort of priced option on this board, with probably the same ownership percentage going above 20%. So I thought at the price tag we were getting, there is some boomer bust nature to him just from what we've gotten recently. I love his ceiling, though. I really cannot believe with the ownership I was seeing, and maybe it makes more sense to me now because you had a higher ownership percentage. And even if it's only 2% that maybe you thought you had to go to him, I was floored when you took Keith Mitchell. I planned my whole build of how can I get Keith Mitchell late to round everything out. And I thought it was a very savvy pick on your part.
So here's what I'll say. I'm going to tell you a quick story because I think this will explain my thought process here. And I've said this a bunch before. If you follow the draft, you've probably heard me say this before. But my quick story is this. I have not always been into golf betting. This started for me during the pandemic is when I got into it. And that was my most year. Oh, did I freeze?
You did freeze. I can hear you now, though. Maybe you might be frozen again. You're good on my end now, Joel.
I'm back now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry about that. So to recap, the reason that first year of me playing PGA Defense, I believe, was my most successful years because this is exactly naturally what happens. You play every week, you get high on somebody, they burn you, they disappoint you, and then you don't want to play them anymore. You're like, hey, I put all these eggs in this basket, and he disappointed, he missed the cut. I'm not going back to this guy because I'm not going to lose money again on the same guy. But the reality is that's an awful thought process because the reality of the situation is if you liked him the week before, not that much has changed in a week. And while you got burned, he's still probably a really good golfer. Maybe something went wrong on a couple holes. He can come back this week and still be really successful. And the real thing that changed is a lot of people have that mentality and the ownership goes down because people don't want to get burned a second time. And so the person who just isn't scared of that and just says, you know what, there's a reason I liked him last week, didn't work out last week, but the same reason why he'll be a good fit this week, I'm going to go back to it at lower ownership. Keith Mitchell's a good golfer. At 9,200, he's probably underpriced in this field. He'll probably end up having closer to the result you expected from him last week, and you're going to get it at a much lower ownership. And so the ability to be able to just have that thought and don't be scared because of the disappointment is what will get you over. And that's exactly what happened here. We loved Keith Mitchell last week. He burned us. Everyone's disappointed. And now you go into this week and most people are just like, I'm not looking that way. Let me get burned by somebody else. And for me, the reason we liked him last week was his ball striking is impeccable. It's going to lead the field. It's going to be one of the top 10 in every model that's run. That is still the case, right? So he's still going to be a really great ball striker in this really weak field. Yes, we know the issue with Keith is going to be his putter. He's got to find a way to make some putts. But, at this point, it's not even him gaining strokes putting. It's more of it's got to just not be a -3 strokes putting. If he can get you -1, I still think he's a top 20 in this event.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I've made a career sports betting with it. It's overcorrections to the market, both positive and negatives. It's the player that gives you the one-off performance that he overachieved in a certain facet of his game that is not sustainable. And they put him into a price range the next week where he doesn't belong. And then on the flip side of that equation, it's what you're talking about here with the golfer, where all the skill sets make sense for why they should find success, but people got burnt and they don't want to go back to them. So whether we're talking about outright bets or matchups or specifically here for DFS, because we can see ownership, that's the nice thing that comes into play. We have some projection. It doesn't mean every single number is going to be 100% accurate with it, but I can tell you more or less what these players are going to come in. And when you start seeing these decreases in projected ownership, that's where you can get overweight to a player that really should be higher priced and higher owned. And it's not because people don't want to get burnt. And you kind of said that best. And I think that's a very flawed mindset that's out there in general. That's one of the reasons specifically why I run my model over a 2-year running perspective. I think when you run things from a shorter duration of time, you can very quickly run into these traps and get yourself into situations to where one good or bad performance overly flaws the numbers with it. And for Mitchell specifically, he looks really good in the short term if you remove putting, and he looks really good in the long term if you remove putting with it. He's the #1 expected ball striker for this course. So I think it goes down to what you talked about here. I can't promise he's going to make putts. I can't promise that he's not going to do what we've seen in the past, but at a lower ownership percentage and our price tag, I think is too cheap. I'm going to keep betting on that profile at an ownership percentage that's going to be lower.
quick question. You mentioned running your model over a 2-year span, which I think for a lot of reasons makes a ton of sense. Are you able, or do you in any way weight your model toward recency? So meaning like, is your model show, okay, I want my numbers to show their form over a 2-year span, how they hit the ball, but I also want to highlight how they've been playing over the last, whatever it might be, 12 tournaments, 3 months, what have you.
I have a very simplified version of it in the model that I release, where you can look at the past 24 rounds. I have a little bit more in depth of a portion of my model on my end with it, but yes, I still typically when I look for recency bias on it, whether that's like positive or negative with it, I'll typically run it over a 2-year running duration. So like I might take, for an example, 70% of that weight of the number that I'm getting, and I might take 30% from the last whatever rounds it is, 12, 24, whatever I'm actually trying to find there, and weigh that into the mix. I'll throw them next to each other. I'll try to figure out where the higher or lower options are from where their trajectory is moving with it. So yeah, there is a portion of my model where I look at that. I typically, for matchups more so, I love the long-term duration of it because I think that tells more of a story. I would say for upside purposes, if you can find some of these players that are moving in a positive direction for win equity, and maybe the market hasn't caught on yet, that's one of the ways this season specifically I've been trying to weigh my model a little bit more aggressively. And, Byron and I have talked about this on our Roto Baller show. There's not just one flat way to make a model. There are certain models that you're going to try to build for safety. If you're looking for matchups, there's going to be certain models that you're going to try to build for upside when you're looking for win equity. I do tend to believe that a lot of the recent metrics kind of show you a little bit more of that recent upside that we've seen. So that's kind of more for me. And it works for GPP contests too. It allows me to find some names like we'll get to him later, but Daniel Berger really fit that mold for me, to where a lot of his recent ball striking is just surging in my sheet and starting to look like past Daniel Berger. There's the same putter concerns that we want to talk about from Mitchell, but that upside that I'm trying to look for really showed in a name like Berger. So I do think that it's very important to not get stuck in one way of building something, because you can end up missing out on different markets that way. And as I said, it's not some perfect strategy to where one model tells the whole story. So hopefully that answered the question, Joel.
It did. I'll just quickly add one small piece to that. This is not this week's tournament, but there's tournaments where we'll break down where being a long driver is important, and we want to target long hitters. But that doesn't mean that every player you play or bet on has to be one of the longer drivers, right? What that means is when you're contemplating where there might be a tie, the long driver has the edge. That's the guy you want to go to. But that doesn't mean the entire top 25 or the top 25 longest hitters, right? Like, that's just not how it's going to play out. So, sometimes we run these models to find the statistical edge, but that's what it is. It's an edge. It's not a math equation that shows you what the result's going to be based on how they hit the ball. So you got to be able to take some of that and then kind of take your data, use it, but pivot off it as well.
Yeah, I like that point. That's one of the reasons too that when I run categories, they're never, like, anybody who views my model will know, they're never straightforward. It's never just driving distance. It's always a weighted total driving. And what does weighted total driving consist of? Well, depending on the tournament, that'll change, but there will be X percentage that goes into driving distance. There will be X percentage that goes into driving accuracy. There will be a couple other nuanced factors when you look at specific course types. Do we have thick rough? How does a player usually find success when they have a shorter course that has thick rough? How does a player work when you can bomb and gouge with it? You add all of that together, and while it does give me an answer of who my best expected total driver is, you're still looking at a very small weight of my model there. And I think that's one of the ways that I'm able to get away from getting caught in the answer that you just talked about of like, oh, this is a driving test week, and all of a sudden Cameron Champ ends up grading number one in your model and he's missed a million cuts in a row. And you're like, I don't understand how I've gotten to that answer. Well, you've gotten to that answer because you've overweighed one little piece of a very large picture of what you're looking at.
Exactly. Yep.
All right, Joel, let's move into the $8,000 section here. To me, it's an interesting range just because we see some dip in ownership for the most part. And everybody's looking between, for me, 7 to about 14%. Seamus would be the high end at 14, and The low end would be Kevin Yu at 7%. Are you trying to get exposure in this section? I know you said how easy it is to make builds. Is this somewhere that you want to be?
There's a few guys in this range that I'm interested in, but for the most part, no. I think this is a section that is, and it's more because I just don't think this is the most talented section. And I think there's guys I actually would prefer in the 7K range and the 8K range, even if they were the same price. I'd rather the 7K guys. So, that's really more where I'm coming from. But I do find it interesting, that like you said, Kevin Yu is the lowest owned in terms of percentage because, you're going to laugh because the theme for at least me this week is really team no putt, and Kevin Yu is certainly puts himself on team no putt. But, I think he grades out pretty well. And that's the type of guy I'd want to target, like strategically. If a guy has some plus statistics in this range and he's going to give me the lowest ownership percentage, he probably makes the most sense. So in this range, I think of the guys I'm most interested in, I think it is, I do like Seamus, who's the highest owned, but Kevin Yu, who's probably the lowest owned, is one of the guys who I would be most interested in this range. And along with who I've mentioned a bunch last night, and definitely will be in my card this week, Adam Svensson.
Yeah, I like Adam Svensson also. Do you have thoughts on Luke Clanton?
He was drafted on our show last night. I can understand it, and I would, if you wanted to play him, I definitely wouldn't tell anyone no. There's a lot of mystery behind it. He's still an unknown. He has been playing well, though, and I think he's a good golfer, so I think there's upside there. I haven't been overweight to playing him, but I can certainly see the reasons why someone would want to get some exposure to him this week.
Yeah, he was drafted by me because you stole Keith Mitchell is how this all came to be, and I ran out of options to pick from. I don't know. I'm conflicted on what I think. My model really likes him in the limited sample size, and I'm probably willing to bet on the upside that I think he possesses. You look at his college profile, you're looking at a golfer that's won, I believe, 3 consecutive times with a handful of top 5 finishes, and that's equated really well to the PGA Tour right now. We're also looking at a name here that has, at the US Open, he was 1 or 2 putts away at the final hole there from really pushing this into a top 35, ends up 3-putting, comes outside the top 40. Last week, he's competing at the tournament, has a real chance to win and make just the second. Nick Dunlap, when he won as an amateur, and then you get him that wins as an amateur, like that hadn't happened with an amateur winning since 1991, I believe, with Phil Mickelson. And Clanton had a real potential to have that happen for a second time. And I've noted this on a couple shows, and Roberto talked about this. I mentioned this last night on, I do links and locks with Roberto over at Action Network, but he was mentioning this, and you even see it in the market. He was the more highly touted prospect between him and Nick Dunlap. And you look at where the prices are in the market this week, he's a favorite over Nick Dunlap. So, I think Dunlap has great par 5 scoring ability. I think he's really starting to put the pieces together. But if I'm weighing one versus the other, I probably lean in the direction of Clanton. That's the way my model pushes it. I agree with you on the Svensson call. I think he's very interesting. My model liked Ben Griffin this week. He had some negative trajectory for upside, but I thought he was fine. Hubbard had the same answer there with talking about that. But the one name for me that I guess I seem to be higher on than the market, and it's a really weird profile we're getting, but it's from Bo Hostler at 8,100. Hostler, for me, entering Sunday last week, was the projected number 1 scorer in my model when I took baseline short game statistics with the actual ball striking. And that is the reverse answer of what you typically expect with Hostler and his lack of ball striking and extreme nature that he puts together with the putter. So, if the ball striking might be making a turnaround here for one of the best putters in the world, I'm intrigued. This is GPP only. This is probably large field contest only, just because I do think he has a really low floor if he doesn't put the pieces together. But I'm willing to take some chances on Hostler in some of these larger field contests, because I don't think you're necessarily going to get high ownership. I see 7.5% right now. You can tell me where you have him, but I can't imagine that he's much off from that total.
I have him at 6, so I've met at even less. And I agree. If you would have asked us at the beginning of the or end of last year and put the pricing for this tournament up, he would have been in the 10K range, right? And so not a full year has gone by, and now he's down here at the 8K range. So And to double down on that, he gained 4 strokes on approach at the Rocket Mortgage, and he lost strokes, 3.5 strokes putting, which is not like him. He's a good putter. So I wouldn't expect him to be a terrible putter again. He typically gains strokes putting. I think Bo Hostler is a good call out of someone who might be heading in the right direction and would look to probably be underpriced at also pretty low ownership in this field. I will add one more thing. I was looking at the numbers when you were going through about Luke Clanton. One more thing to add about him that does make him maybe interesting to play is, listen, it's a small sample size. It's only 2 tournaments, but they were both in June within the last month. He gained a ton of strokes driving on both tournaments, the U.S. Open and the Rocket Mortgage. He was plus and pretty healthy plus on approach in both tournaments. He was pretty bad around the green in both those tournaments. And if there's one place where that shouldn't hurt you, it's here, right? Around the green game, it shouldn't be a huge detriment to him. So if he's going to be plus striking the ball on his driver and on approach, and he's going to make putts like he's been doing, and he gets neutralized by his one weakness, which we've seen, again, it's only been 2 tournaments, it should be a good spot for him this week.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just to touch on the Bo thing one more time, I think the way of betting him to win or a top 10 is probably the exact way of going about it if you're trying to find his upside. And then in GPP contests, same answer that comes into play there. We have a lot of people watching right now. If anybody has any questions, don't be shy. Feel free to put them into the chat. Joel and I will get to them before this show wraps up. When we move into the $7,000 range here, there's a lot of players. We don't need to talk about every single one of them. If you want to just give me a couple that you're going to be overweight on this week, maybe a name or 2 that you're going to be fading completely, I think that would help everybody out there listening.
I think another guy that's really interesting for this week, and is a similar concept to, not quite as good, but similar concept to Keith Mitchell, is Lee Hodges, right? And I think Lee Hodges is now looking at, I'm seeing him at 6.5%. I'm not sure if you have similar. But he's all the way down here priced at $7,500. And heading into the week, he missed the cut at the Rocket Mortgage. But in May, he had 2 12 places in a row at the PGA and the Charles Schwab. He gained a ton of strokes on approach. He hit the ball really well at the Travelers, missed some putts, but he's a good putter. I think this is a week where he can find that putter. He gained over 2 strokes putting 3 weeks in a row from the Wells Fargo, the PGA Championship, and the Charles Schwab. He's also really good striking the ball. I think he finds some of that. He lost strokes on approach at the Rocket Mortgage, but he's been consistently pretty positive in that area. And it seems to me this is another one of those immediate, like, hey, he disappointed last week, so let's get off him, where I think that's a mistake. I feel that people should probably go back to Lee Hodges well, which I will for sure this week. And going down, I know you like as well Daniel Berger. I'll let you touch on him, but the guy right next to him I also like is Andrew Novak, who I feel at this point in the year, and it might be the boring name theory where it's like there's not that much excitement about Andrew Novak, but he's outplayed the price tag that they're putting on him. Even the last 2 weeks at the RBC Canadian, the last 2 tournaments he's played in, he was 14th. At the Rocket Mortgage, he was 20th. He's gaining strokes on his approach quite often this season. He's a positive putter. There's not much to not like about his game. The only thing that you might be a little concerned about is his driving accuracy on this course. But it's not like he's horrendous. It's maybe average to slightly below average. I think Andrew Novak's someone who I would have thought would have been priced $1,000 more in this field.
I thought there were so many players between that 7,000 to 7,400 range that kind of go to that same answer that you just talked about, Joel, where for the most part, they're very equivalent to the $8,000 golfers that we're talking about. And you could very easily flip and swap them depending on exactly how well they were playing in the spot entering this weekend. For whatever reason, the market decided to push these names lower. And there's a lot of these very prototypical answers. And I'll even include Patton Kizzire, who's 6,900 into this mix here. Kind of goes down to a section, but I think he's worth talking about with these names. But like him, we talked about Ben Silverman off the air, all of us, which was funny. And I think we all had a similar agreement that Silverman is very playable in this tournament. I thought he was too cheap. He was one of those names that I full faded last week. And to me, this is where you can get a little bit differing with your opinions. When you have a golfer that does not fit a course, like he did not fit Detroit, and he's able to go out there, competes in the top 10 of the leaderboard for most of the week, finishes inside the top 20, enters Sunday as a legitimate top 10 expected performer in the tournament. To me, that just means he's playing really good golf. So now all of a sudden you give him a venue here where there is a much better projected upside for him than we were getting. I think he's an interesting name to keep under consideration for a guy that I only see right now at 5% ownership. Chandler Phillips is an interesting name. I talked about Dylan Wu. Dylan Wu is going to be my matchup target against SH Kim, but high upside numbers for him there. Like playing him in GPP contests at sub 5%. You mentioned Jonathan Vegas. Feels like a really nice spot to go to Jonathan Vegas with some of the ball striking that he's put together. You know, Justin Lauer, Jacob Bridgman, Daniel Berger. I think the Lee Hodges shout-outs makes a lot of sense. There's just so many names to consider here. And because there's so many names to consider, it makes it really simple pricing because there are between Rio. I didn't even talk about Rio. I mean, Rio is probably my favorite play on the entire board. If you move up a little bit, you know, Rio, Berger, one of those other names I've talked about, like that's a very simple start to a build where you still have everything at your exposure to where you can get to with it. So I think lineups are very simple to put together this week just because the high-end names didn't get very high-end priced with it. But I guess my favorite play would be Rio based off of everything that I've said. And then my least favorite play, just to give an answer based off of this, let me scroll through these names really fast. I guess it would probably be, I mean, there's no ownership around him. I was very low on Joseph Bramlett. I have a matchup against Bramlett this week outside of the top 100 in my model. Let me see if I can find somebody that has a little bit more.
Well, I'll add to this question. I think, especially in a tournament like this, like we've mentioned, it's watered down, it's a weaker field. A way I want to look at my betting card is more toward less targeting upside and guys I really like and target the guys I don't like, right? There's some guys that just said not in good form, mispriced, and I just want to go after them and just say they're just not going to play well, and I want to bet against them. And I want to ask you, are there a few guys that you're targeting this week in betting markets?
Yeah, and that's typically my answer to begin with. If we're talking matchups, that's pretty much the whole blueprint of my game is find an opponent that I am lower on the market of somebody I want to take on and do it against an opponent that there is a safe enough grade in my model. Like I'm not going to just fade Joseph Bramlett against an equivalent to Joseph Bramlett just because I want to take Joseph Bramlett on. You run into unfortunate situations where you sometimes don't find the right opponent in these spots, but you know, Bramlett was one of them. SH Kim was another. Like I'll bring up very quickly in my model who some of the worst values were in my sheets because I think you get a lot of interesting names here. So the worst value, Joseph Bramlett, Thorbjorn Olesen, who for some reason my model liked last week and doesn't like this week. So I tried to find a matchup against him, couldn't necessarily do it. I tried to figure out a way to take on Alejandro Tosti, couldn't figure out a way to take him on. Michael Thorbjornsen. I thought there was a really interesting bet for round one, and the number unfortunately moved before I could even recommend it. So this isn't something that I'm on myself even, but I thought Jonathan Vegas in round one against Thorbjornsen was a really savvy way to try to get some value. That number moved 15, 20 points at a lot of the books and kind of rightfully so in that spot. But no, to answer your question, Joel, like that's legitimately how I bet matchups. It's just, you're never going to find me in the superstar versus superstar matchups. That's just not where I'm going to be. I'm trying to find, and this is why I like tournaments with a cut. I'm trying to find miscut equity. I'm trying to find players that I don't think are going to make it to Saturday. I'm trying to find golfers that the market is much higher on than I am. And I'm trying to find opponents that I'm able to back that the market maybe isn't necessarily at that moment. And, you know, one of the fortunate things or unfortunate things, depending on how you want to look at it, is markets react for my matchups very quickly. It's an unfortunate thing because it's harder to recommend plays because when a number shifts 20, 25, 30 points in the span of 5 minutes, last week I recommended a head-to-head wager. It was Carson Young over Silverman, funny enough. And it was over at Bet Online. I gave that play out at Rotoballer. It was pulled off the board 1.5 minutes after the bet was recommended there. It was put back on the board 30 points higher than where it was recommended. And, you know, throughout the week, it got bet back down. And I told everybody, just be patient. We'll jump back in. We don't need to take a bad number here. And I think at the end of the day, it's all about trying to find value, but it's also a fortunate thing because when you have the ability to shift the market, and it's not something that I'm going to be doing with people that I am giving picks to, because we're not trying to influence a market one way or another. But, this is how you get yourself banned from a casino, by the way. Like, this is like the 101 of how you get banned. But if you have the ability to shift the market, this is why sometimes books will take action from the Billy Walters of the world, because they don't want Billy Walters to come in with a $500,000 bet on Ben Silverman over Carson Young and then say, gotcha, after you move the line and drop it for, $3 million on the other end of it. But, it's one of those things when you can move a number, you kind of know it's going to shift with it. So that's kind of where my matchups end up landing, Joel. It's becoming much more difficult to tail and to give them out, but we try the best we can in the Rotoballer chat with it.
Yeah, that's extremely hard. I think to your point, right? You got to just recommend the plays, and then you got to find the number that you're most comfortable with. But to your point that you're making, and I totally agree with, sometimes that does mean that if the number was good on Monday, you liked it, but you thought about it, and it's no longer good on Wednesday, you just don't take it. And maybe it's okay to just wait till next week and not have to just force it because you didn't get the number you originally liked.
Yeah, I always try to have at least a 3% edge on any matchup that I give out, just because I know a number is going to move. And that's kind of I always am transparent on what I would play the number up to with it. But typically, if you can have a little bit of a larger edge, that works out. Just to talk about this Aaron Rye discussion very quickly. If he wins the tournament, Joel, does he wear 2 gloves as he holds the trophy?
I think he has to, right? He's got to, it's his trademark. He can't take it away. He's got to just shine with his trademark in the face of the people.
We'll talk about who we think's going to win. If anybody wants to know, it's probably going to be the pick I'm going to give with Aaron Rye there if you've been following me this week. But let's wrap this up in the $6,000 section. As I said, think there's soft pricing throughout. There's a lot of names to consider down here. Who are some of those options that you're on?
The 6K range is tough this week. There's a world where you don't even really have to go down here all that much, especially if you don't love some of these guys. You mentioned he was drafted last night, Patton Kizzire. I think he does make sense, so I like him. We also mentioned last night Ryan Moore. I think the audience ended up drafting him. He's definitely going to be a captain of Team No Putt. I think this tournament is going to make Team No Putt look good in models of the way it's kind of set up. So I think Ryan Moore is grading out really well. He does strike the ball well. The problem with Ryan Moore is, and while I like Ryan Moore, and he's made some cuts this year, he really doesn't have many good results, if any at all. And just a made cut, not really enough. I think the best, he has a 5th at the Valspar back in March, which, that counts. But other than that, he doesn't have anything better than a, 31st also. So, the positive also about Ryan Moore is at the Rocket Mortgage, he gained stretch putting, which is a rarity for him. If he found something and can be positive putting, I do think there's certainly upside with him here. After that, I'm going to be pretty late. I know you liked, or you may mention Troy Merritt, which I think he makes some sense. I even would consider Carson Young, but these are now starting to be kind of darts that we're throwing toward the end of the board. In terms of guys I'd be heavy on or prioritizing, I'm going to be pretty light in the 6K range.
There probably is in reality a very slight uptick when you look at the Dylan Woos, Chandler Phillips, Ben Silvermans, Justin Lauer, Jonathan Vegas. Like, I would rather get to those names if I could. If I do find myself down into the 6s, though, David ended up taking Troy Merritt. I agree with his take on it. I think he's a top 45 sort of play here that's being priced outside of that zone. We talked about Patton Kizzire. I think there's a lot of playability. I know he's going to be 8 to 9% owned, but my model had him at like 12% being what the fair total was. So in reality, you're probably getting a little bit of a rebate there based off of that. And, look, we talk about chalk, and I know at Win Daily, one of the monikers there is you don't play low price chalk. And while I agree with a lot of that, I will say that there are certain positions where you are much higher than the market on a player. I still think there's a ton of playability that comes into play there. So that's why Patton Kizzire is still in my player pool based off of that discussion. I think Sam Ryder has interesting upside if you're just boomer busting like a GPP play. I also like the Carson Young. I was all over Carson Young last week. started off hot, fell apart, and then got it together for the most part on Friday. Just played a couple bad holes to miss the weekend, but really high upside climber for me in my model to where he could be a potential GPP winner, in my opinion, if you do find yourself down here. But I agree. It's very simple to make a build. It's not like you're going to be finding yourself with multiple options probably from this range. But if you do, there are a handful of names I still like.
Well, there's one guy I want to ask you about. Are you interested or have you considering for this week Harry Higgs?
My model was out on him. Maybe I'm a little bit behind on the data because he dominated in a lot of his starts leading into getting himself back into these tournaments, and maybe some of that 2-year running data is hurting him over the top with what I'm getting here, just because you would like to think a better player when you win a handful of Corn Ferry events leading into this, but I don't think I can get there with him. Like, I see him at 4 to 5% ownership, and for me, that is too high when I would rather take Carson Young at the same ownership percentage. So like, if we're going to be talking about that ownership range.
I'm with you. I don't love Harry Higgs, but I do think there's some intrigue. Like, I think there's some upside to him. I think he's playing better. He's really good around the greens and making putts. So, I'm not going to be overweight and looking to play Harry Higgs everywhere I can. But if I'm building 10 lineups and one of them needs a guy at, 6,400 to squeeze in, I might throw Harry Higgs in a lineup or two.
He's probably more boom or bust, which isn't a bad thing. I don't even give that answer as a bad way to look at this. Boom potential is good. We talk about all the time that these rakes in these contests are high, and you need to, when you put the pieces together, you need to be Joel, and you need to win 50 grand when you get into those spots. So if you're just getting raked to death in these moments, like, always my advice to everybody would be a little bit more aggressive than you think you need to be in spots. Just because you're shooting for the moon, you're trying to win contests. You're not looking to come in a min cash. A min cash will get you raked off the site.
And to your point, the one thing I'll add to that is there are guys that, like, and Spencer mentions this a lot, like, this guy grades better for safety than anything. Like, there's guys that on paper are going to look a lot better, and we'll use Harry Higgs as the example, right? But like, when we say them, there'll also be very limited upside. So if you're playing a GPP, the safer guy who is limited upside is the guy who you play Harry Higgs over, because Harry Higgs will likely in a matchup lose, but the one tournament where he plays really well will get you a top 10 versus the safer pick, maybe like a Brendan Todd type, right? Will maybe get you the top 30, which is like fine, but it's not going to win you a GPP.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the number one way to view when you're building DFS lineups. Whatever the over is on this bet, smash the over on the Aaron Rye gloves worn. That is free money of all free money there. You're not going to get an easier bet than that. Joel, I'll let you get out of here very quickly. One of the things I usually do at the end of the show with Nick and I is we will run through these sections, just favorite play, least favorite play. We'll rapid fire through this. So if we start in the $10,000 and up section, favorite play on the board, least favorite play. You can preface that with, if there's not a least favorite play, who are you lower on?
Favorite play will be Sungjae Im. And for least favorite play, I will say I'll have to go with Jordan Spieth.
I will say my favorite play is Aaron Rye. My least favorite play would be, I probably agree with you on the Jordan Spieth call. There's just too much ownership. It's a different discussion to be had if he actually does come in at 5 or 6% own. At 12 to 14%, you can beat me with him at that point.
Agreed.
All right, $9,000 section, Joel.
All right, 9,000. You're not going to like it. Favorite play, Keith Mitchell. Least favorite play, you're really not going to like it. Maybe I'll change it just to not hurt your feelings. Yeah,
give me the real answer. I'm the big boy.
I am going to change it. So I was going to say Jason Day, but I'm changing my mind on Jason Day because I actually think at the ownership level, he probably makes more sense. My least favorite play is actually JT Poston because of the ownership.
That hurts my feelings more.
More is it? I think people are overrating JT Poston this week. I could burn me. Listen, he's done really well here. But he's just not in good form. And I think, when he has had some of these really good finishes, he was playing better golf going into the week. I don't think he's in that form right now. I'm not going to be playing JT Poston.
Can I give you my take on JT Poston very quickly?
Yeah.
So I've made this argument a couple times that there are certain players that have been hurt in these elevated events, playing contests that are longer than they should be for their game. And JT Poston is one of those prime examples that every single time this season that he got a course that was too long for his game, it not only gave him a bad result, but kind of put him in a bad form leading past that moment there. I kind of think that Poston has recovered from everything that happened there. And we now finally get him on a course that should suit his game. He's a birdie maker that can find high-end potential. So I'm going to say that JT Poston is my favorite play. I'm going to roll reverse you on that one. Keith Mitchell would be the second choice. It's just Mitchell is very volatile, and I have no problems with playing him. He would be my second option if Poston wasn't available, but Poston will be my favorite play there. As far as the Jason Day thing goes, Joel, like, we've broken up a long time ago. It's Wyndham and I don't talk about past relationships. It's not something I do with that. So Jason Day is a thing of the past. I'll probably
Wait,
say,
hold on, time out. Real quick question. So if Jason Day goes out and wins the tournament this week, you feel nothing. Just
I would be. It's like when you date somebody, and let's just say you're dating whoever, and they end up and they go and they marry some famous person. It's like, oh, well, good for them. It means nothing to me anymore.
wow, you've really moved on. I'm proud of you, Spencer. Man.
There was a time when we were doing PGA Draftcast. I never sent you what it was, but for Valentine's Day, I wrote a whole Valentine's Day poem for Jason Day when I thought he was going to win again, and he ended up not winning, so the poem didn't get revealed on the show. But we're not at the same moment, him and I, that we used to be.
All right. Sad.
I'll say my least favorite play is probably Sam Stevens, just because I think he's borderline safe, but to me, he's the one option of this group that didn't fit with everybody else. It's like if you were to tell me one of these things is not like the other here, it would probably be Stevens for the price. If he was cheaper, we could have a different discussion.
All
right, $8,000 range.
My favorite play here, I want to go with Adam Svensson. And for my least favorite play, I mean, there's a number of guys that I am just going to be full fading. So to pick a least favorite play, I'm going to pick someone based on ownership percentage. And I'm going to go with Mark Hubbard.
I will say this is where I agree with you. For the most part, this is not a section that I'm looking to get overly invested in. Talked about liking Svensson. I think Lucas Glover is fine if you're trying to find that absolute team no putt sort of a moniker with it. I'll go with Luke Clanton just because he's 10% owned, and I don't know what he is at this moment, and sometimes the unknown and that new shiny toy that you don't exactly know what they're going to produce as. I'll bet the upside that he is as good as advertised there. For my least favorite play, well, I don't dislike this player. I'm starting to worry that the ownership continues to go up. I'll give Seamus, but I do think Seamus is pretty safe. So it's one of those things. I don't expect him to miss the cut, but I don't know how much a 27th place finish actually does for me if that's where he ends up landing.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All right, $7,000 section, and then we'll get us out of here after we get to the sixes.
All right, 7K.
Joel is frozen, it looks like. So I'll take this first. I will take Ryo Hitsatsune with an honorable mention to Daniel Berger. I'll say my least favorite play would be probably S.H. Kim. S.H. Kim's putter has been really stout recently, and it's been carrying him. But outside of the top 100 for me, in expected total driving and expected weighted proximity. So you throw those two pieces together, I think there's a downside that comes into play. One of the reasons why I bet Dylan Wu in that matchup. If I move down into the 6,000s, probably Patton Kizzire would be my favorite play. Ownership would give you a very similar answer there. Least favorite play, I don't really love giving these least favorite plays in the $6,000 range just because, look, if you're down in that section, you're either playable or you're not, or most of the times you're looking at very low ownership to begin with a lot of these names. I probably want nothing to do with Peter Malnati, but those would be how I wrap it up. Joel, I'll kick it back to you.
Sorry about that. Computer issues during the day, messed it up. My bad. I'll fall on the sword for that one. So when I got cut off, I was in my favorite play, the 7K range, was Joel Dahman. There's probably, I think, Spence, you said the same thing. There's probably 4 to 5 guys that I have very similar. I like Domin a lot, but I could probably name 4 or 5 guys in that range that I would have been pretty high on. My least favorite play in the 7K range, there's a number of guys, here that you could touch, but I think you mentioned as a guy you were targeting, a guy who I just don't think is a good course fit here. Alejandro Tosti, I think he's going to struggle missing these fairways a lot and getting up and down. So going down to the 6K range, like I said before, I'm going to be pretty low in exposure here. But if my top play, I'm going to give it, because of the ownership, I do like Carson Young. I know we mentioned him a few times. He was, T14 at the Canadian, T30 at the Byron Nelson. He does possess upside. So that's the type of guy, if I'm dipping down here, I want to target. And for my least favorite play, I'm going to just give it the whole range. I mean, I'm not going to have exposure to more than 2 guys in the 6K range, maybe 3 at most. So there's a lot of, there's a lot not to like in the 6K range.
If I could re-give the picks, I think you probably hit it on the head with Carson Young there, just because 4% ownership is a really enticing return when Kazire is going to be 8.5 or 9. Going to play Kazire, have no problems with that ownership there. But if you're shooting for the moon, I do think Carson Young makes a lot of sense. Have a first-round leader bet on him tomorrow. Going to play him in large field contests. Fine betting him up into that top 10 sort of range if you really want to get aggressive with it. But for everybody who made it through the entire hour here, we appreciate you tuning in. Nick and I will continue to try to get back to this show more on a weekly basis. Joel, I appreciate you filling in for Nick this week. Tell everybody where they can find you. Talk a little bit again, if you want, about our PGA Draftcast show, and then I'll take us out of here.
That's it. You'll find us on Tuesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Draftcast. Spencer, myself, and David Bileski, we do a draft. The audience can participate in the draft. I know Zach Jeffers is in the chat here. I think a few of you are tuned into that show as well. So that's where you'll find me. The show's a lot of fun. Don't tune in next week. We'll crown a winner. We'll draft again for that tournament. And on Twitter, I'm not always around, but if you want to find some of my posts, I'm at Draftmaster Flex.
Yeah, as Joel said, you can find him on Twitter at Draftmaster Flex. I am at Tee Off Sports. If you have any questions about the week from any perspective, you can feel free to reach out to us at one of those handles. You can also contact Nick and I at Bettor Golf Pod. And as I said at the beginning, use the code BGP to get your match bonus over on Underdog. The site is buzzing with different sports that you can play weekly when diving into their season-long best ball drafts. Get into that for football if you haven't done so already. They also have pick'em contests that you can take on. Remember, Underdog has everything you need to gain action for the week for any sport that you want to be on. Thanks again for all the support for everyone who does tune into the show with Nick and I. As I said, we will try to be back here more frequently, but until then, good luck this week. Let's try to win some money, and we will see you guys back here again very shortly.